Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I want to continue talking about Alexander Theroux, who is not a newcomer to the literary scene, but he is new on my radar. Well, I've known about him probably for the last 5 years or so. I've been seeing the name and definitely Darconville's cat, but haven't really acted on it at all. But then just recently I finally decided to take the plunge because Stephen Moore's book is coming out from Zero Gram Press. This is the press that brought us Novel Explosives and then Stephen Moore's My Back Pages, but this is Alexander Theroux, A Fan's Notes. And like it says on the copy, it is the first book-length study of Theroux's complete body of work, which is quite a body of work. When I first found out about Theroux and did some, cursory investigation, I just came up with 3 WOGS and Laura Warholic and some poems and of course Darconville's cat, but I had no idea the volume of work that he has created, not to mention the wealth of unpublished treasures that are piling up on his desk. I can't talk too much about this book yet. I will give it a proper review closer to its release date on September 1st. I will, however, be pulling in some biographical information and some critical details from Stephen Moore's book, mostly because they also appear here in the spring 1991 issue that covers Alexander Theroux and Paul West from the Review of Contemporary Fiction. There is a great essay in here from Martin C. Battiston, and it's entitled Alexander Theroux in Virginia and London, 1964 through 1973. Martin Battiston was a teacher at the University of Virginia when Theroux was there for his master's degree and subsequently his PhD. And then he became a very good friend and a longtime correspondent. And I've made a couple more acquisitions of Theroux's work over this last week. This is from David R. Godine, the publisher there in Boston. And this is the slim little 32-page essay, Theroux Metaphrastes, an essay on literature. This will be the focus of this video. I also picked up one of his fables, also from Godine. It's called the Sin of Sepilok Waif, and it's illustrated by Stan Washburn. And you can see it's on these, it's this nice little production here. The dust jacket is held up really nicely. It's on cloth boards. I have not read this one yet. I'm also waiting for a couple of his other fables to come in. I also have The Strange Case of Edward Gorey, which was put out by Fantagraphics, and The Lollipop Trollops, which I have since found out by reading in the Review of Contemporary Fiction issue that this was originally going to be for a novel he was working on, but then he ended up using it for his poems. And one of the things you'll see if you read through the earlier work, and Stephen Moore brings it up a lot in his forthcoming book, is that Theroux has so much work that he's in the middle of. You'll see that he constantly throughout his career refers to like his collection of essays or his collection of short stories. Neither of which of those we have seen even to this day, but one can be hopeful. 2 pieces that I will bring out, like I said, from Theroux's book, and mainly because this is the only authoritative text we have. Yes, there's Wikipedia and various articles and writings and so on, but as far as a very meticulously researched work with a lot of authority, and not to mention, the direct, long-time correspondence between Stephen Moore and Alexander Theroux, this is the only definitive or authoritative volume we have. So let's go through the chronology. Theroux was born 1939 in Medford, Massachusetts, and then he attended Medford High School. Then he joined the Trappist monastery at St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. And I believe, if I've got this right, it was I believe it was at the Trappist monastery where Thomas Merton was also there studying to be a master. He joined the Franciscan Seminary in Callicoon, New York, then St. Francis College in Bedford, Maine, where he got his BA, and he contributed a lot of fiction, poetry, and essays to the school magazine called The Canticle. And then in 64 and 65, he got his master's degree at the University of Virginia, and he did it on, this is the title of his master's degree thesis, Samuel Beckett, The Emunction of Language, an approach to the epistemology of words. And as Battiston points out, in both the master's degree and the PhD, which was also on Samuel Beckett, it was apparently less about Samuel Beckett than it was about the language of Samuel Beckett, the words. And of course, anybody with even a passing knowledge of Theroux will know that he is obsessed with words. And then emunction of language. Emunction, using that word hints at something that Theroux does so well. And emunction means basically a sneeze. And then also, like I said, University of Virginia, he did his PhD, and it was on the language of Samuel Beckett. And also while he was there, he continued to contribute fiction, plays, and poetry to the school literary magazines. And in fact, he wasn't even part of the drama department, but they featured many of his plays. He got a Fulbright grant to England, and while he was there, that's when he worked on what would become his debut novel, 3 WOGS, which I've already reviewed. I'll put the link to that video down below. He started teaching at Longwood College, Virginia, and his years there feature in Darconville's Cat. He began publishing stories and essays in major magazines at that time, and that is something that has continued for 50-some years. He got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he started teaching at Phillips Andover Academy. Then he published Master Snickup's Cloak, which is another of his illustrated fables. Then in 1981, Darconville's Cat was published. Then he went to teach at MIT. Then he went to teach at Yale, where he became a regular contributor to the Arts and Antiques magazine. Then he published his novel, An Adultery. And then the Review of Contemporary Fiction devoted that half issue to him that I just showed. He got a Lannan Literary Award for Fiction in 1991. And then many publications over the years. And then he got a Clifton Fadiman Medal from the Mercantile Library in 2002. His last major publication was Einstein's Beats, which I've brought up in a few videos. That was in 2017. And then in 2017 and 2019, he prepared his collected stories, where he is revising older stories and writing several new ones. That is still yet to find a publisher. And then 2019 to the present, he has apparently revived a decades-old biography of Amelia Earhart, and he has continued to write poetry. I'll put the link to his, what Stephen Moore calls his checklist of publications down below, because Stephen Moore does keep the PDF of this checklist updated on his website, although I don't think it's as up-to-date as the one that's in this book. But just flipping through, you can see these are the books and pamphlets in that first section, and then it contributions. But then if you look to contributions to periodicals, which include book reviews, dramas, essays, fiction, and poetry, it is unbelievable, the wealth of publications over the years. If we read a couple of selections from Martin Battiston's essay, he talks about how when Theroux was there doing his graduate work at the University of Virginia, 2 of the papers that he turned in to Battiston, one was on the scholastic tradition in Tristram Shandy, and then another one entitled The Words in the Dunciad, an approach to the evil of verbal inanity. And Battiston says, both were brilliant. I marked them A+, and both, I came to see, obviously hinted at Alex's later interests as a writer of fiction. I also remember reading them both with a sheet of paper at hand on which I jotted down the words I had never seen before. Words not merely ostentatious, though that was some of the fun of them, but functional, hitting, as I saw after I had looked them up, every nail precisely on the head. And that's exactly what I said in my video about 3 WOGs. Some of the fun of the whole experience was I did just what Battiston did, what anyone would have to do. I jotted down these words that I'd never seen before, and when I went and looked them up and placed them, of course, in the context I had just read, it was incredible to see just how perfectly he employed that word. As Battiston says, Alex seems to have sensed with St. John and Wittgenstein that words being the elements that comprise our worlds, it follows that the surer our command of words is, the fuller our experience of life will be. Battiston also humorously tells us he was, in fact, a calculated study in black. Black trousers, black cape, in time even an antique black Bentley he brought back from England. At first glance, he seemed an avatar of St. John the Baptist well on his way to becoming Hamlet. And eventually, he starts to become quite well known around Charlottesville. And in fact, it says, by now his local fame was such that one of Charlottesville's commercial radio stations had been prepared to put him on the air. And of course, he then went and conducted the interview on air and spoke exactly like you would expect him to from reading his books. But from what you get, the sense you get from Battiston's essay is that he was very well loved and a very nice and funny guy, despite all of his extreme intelligence and some of his austere sentiments from, probably coming from having given himself to the Roman Catholic Church and being in that Trappist monastery for a while. Battiston even talks about how Spartan his room was there on campus. But despite all these things and all this incredible learning, he seemed to have had a great sense of humor. And this is very important for us to bring to his work, and especially Theroux Metaphrastes, because it can easily be taken as just purely elitist or purely vast heights of pretension and condescension and turn you off. But you have to locate Theroux in some of his sources, some of the people that he really connected with, which would be Frederick Roeff and Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. You have to understand that he's bringing this wit and erudition together with satire and humor, because really, even though it is intense and lacerating, it's just as much self-deprecating and fun. I think it's appropriate for me to pull a little bit of Alexander Pope from this, my Oxford Book of Verse, looking at the first few lines of A Little Learning. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring. There shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. This is exactly what Theroux wants to do. He wants to drink deeply from the Pierian spring. Theroux Metaphrastes, an essay on literature. First of all, this is probably the absolute best place to start if you can get your hands on it. You can find this collector's edition. Look at the original price there, $125. I certainly didn't pay that. But you can get this original standalone edition, or there is an edition of 3 WOGs where this is printed in the back. My copy does not have that. But if you're considering reading Theroux, and you're not really sure if it's going to be, connect with you, I would suggest, or if you read Theroux and you're completely confused as to how someone could possibly like this kind of stuff, this is the essay to read so that you can situate his purpose. It's very important to know, the purpose of what a writer is trying to do. Otherwise, you may use an incorrect rubric to evaluate their work. Like I said, it is elitist, it is lacerating, but it's intelligent, it's very passionate, and above all, it is highly entertaining. He even introduces this fictional 16th century cardinal to exemplify the style of writing that Theroux is after. The impetus for the essay was in 1972 in Book World. Diane Johnson gave a sort of dismissive review to 3 WOGS, and she called it exasperating. And he talks about that in the beginning, but then he quickly moves on from just upbraiding the reviewer to giving us exactly what the title entails, and that is an essay on his literature. Metaphrastes, this comes from Simeon the Metaphrastes and his Metaphrastes, where he did some huge volume of work on the lives of saints. And in general, Metaphrastes means a translator or editor. And in this way, Theroux is providing a translation of himself or of his work. But in particular, it means someone who transforms artifice from one form to another. For example, poetry into prose and vice versa. The entire essay is a real treat, and I'll have to work hard. I had to work hard to be very selective about which portions to pull out. Otherwise, I would just read the whole thing. The note at the beginning is very important. It sets the stage, as any good essay would, for the whole thesis. It says, "I have a very amplified prose style. You will understand little of this white paper, reader, and sympathize with less in assuming outright that nothing worthwhile can proceed from that extremity," the extremity of amplified prose. "I want to make a distinction between 2 rhetorical terms, inflatio and amplificatio. Amplificatio is not a fault. I would plump for it being a virtue. I come down on the side of amplificatio, as did Burton, Montaigne, Rabelais, Sterne, and others memorably innumerable. It is a group in advocate of the many-membered period. I excerpt myself from this list in order to win you over right away." So you can see it's playful. He is on the heights of Olympus, but he's also rhetorically playful. One thing that he rails against is what he calls the fatuously relativistic nicety, current today in the world of fiction, today being 1975, that less is more, and also to tell it like it is. Based on those 2 dicta in the world of writing at the time, this is how he responds. "To the wood-hewing Gibeonite, the miseducated snool in factory shoes, it's irksome. And my less than Homeric reviewer visibly had no patience for it, she, poor thing, with small Latin, less Greek, and an utter void, apparently, when it comes to a knowledge of what we today have inherited from the beautiful Franco-Latin-English trilingualism of the Norman period. Ours is fated, a tempest to Cindy. Tell it," so the unedifying lollipop today has it, "like it is. Less, one insists, is more. Say it, you will nag. Eschew surplusage," snapped Twain, that anti-European, anti-Catholic pinch fist from the American Midwest with his unlovely spray of scentless botanicals. "Blink the incidentals. Fract that chicken, scumble that depth of field, rip off that wainscoting, slubber that gloss, steam down those frills. Ah, but these, you see, are not the cries of people with lexical gifts and the leisure, the languor necessary to art." He makes the point about classical heroes, the glory that was the ancient hero, Odysseus, Achilles, Aeneas, Beowulf, even Hamlet and Milton's Satan, was in fact often bound up with the glory of his speech. His gift that way seemed to be the linchpin of that very heroism, the logical extension of his grandeur. Language alone was the living organism that formed the perfectly wedded relationship between mind and reality. So language, he's seeing it as Wittgenstein did, where it's that link, that living organism between the mind and reality. And so if we strip that down to where it's just this impoverished Spartan capacity, then we are shrinking our world. But after he rails on for a while on these beautifully crafted rants and tangents, he finally says, "I am a fearful Jesuit, I don't doubt. I am an antiquary, a pedant, a metaphysical deacon and special student on lease from the University of Padua, with a swag bag filled with ciphers, bolts, and refutations. I am a Roman Catholic, born to its jewels and bulls, and constantly aware of its Byzantine smoke, wrought chasubles, traditional liturgies, and litanies infinite. You can find me, you're thinking to yourselves, and oh, I suppose you're right, hunched over Albert Piga's Hierarchiae Ecclesiasticae Assertio, Demosthenes' Exordia, or Ebo's Life of the Apostle of Pomerania, or becloseted, pushing notions around on full scap with a goblet of mulled wine at my elbow and finding everything after Joyce an impertinence. Well, that may be so. And maybe it has something to do with trying to justify the anthrax of my novel, meaning 3 WOGS, the conception of which is the formal cause of this present donation. I feel that this is a great point, in addition to the point with classical heroes being heroes because that's bound up with their grand rhetoric, their grand language. He makes this quick little point in a short sentence. It says, the unnecessariness of the world is the source of its beauty. And what he means is, what he's getting at in this paragraph is that God as an artist has made this complex world. He could have just made things work very simply, but when we break down like how the eye works or how certain things in nature work, and we begin to see their complexities and just the unnecessariness of a lot of these things, that's what brings it its beauty. As you can imagine, he lambastes the current state of affairs in American writing. He says, at the time of this writing, there is no towering poet, playwright, or novelist alive in the United States. Your fretting over that sentence proves it. And then he starts to question why this is. He says, is it because the stress today is on doing rather than making? Is it because a vision sufficiently explained is a vision divested of its charisma? Is it because the visual has replaced the verbal? Does the contemporary writer have all of Proust's allergies and none of his talent? All of Dostoevsky's hand-wringing and none of his passion? All of Burton's madness and none of his measure? All of Corvo's opinion and none of his conviction? All of Rimbaud's filth and none of his genius? All of Wilde's color, none of his wit? All of Goethe's tears, none of his sorrow? And all of Christ's message and none of his beliefs? The modern disposition is to read through words, style, language to the story. In other words, we just want to go right at the story, and the words, the style, and the language are burdensome things that we need to get out of the way. And the way that he gives an example to highlight this is classic Theroux. He says, one picture of Porky Nero thumbing his rebec makes gratuitous Gibbon's history. No detail, as the bureaucrat and comrade secret agent says so often, spare me the details. But it is just in those details, in the words, the style, and the language, that Theroux thrives. Yet, having read 3 WOGS and a few other things so far, there's very much story too. He's not saying dispense completely with story. In fact, his storytelling is very modern and very linear. And then finally we get a beautiful sign-off. You, sympathetic listener, have I enlisted, nolens volens, in accompanying me on a voyage past a small enough monument of prose to yet another book. And may it be granted too that this work daren't ever shrink from struggling midway out of a nice enough phrase to waltz off on the nimble feet of a parenthesis. And may, O friends of ceremony, patient with a prose that never hesitates to drop its sweet aromatic gums, may you understand that by knowing the difference between inflatio and amplificatio, night, you see, and day, that you will become that much more my ideal reader, which is happily to say, my friend.